Hello there, and as you can tell from the title, today we're going to be talking about some heavy stuff, and to be honest, I wasn't that sure if this was a good idea or not. I've been told that every time you talk about politics or religion, you cut your audience in half. But I've got a lot of opinions that I want to talk about, and I figured that it was better to cut my audience in half now, when it's tiny, rather than 6 months down the line, when I've got 5 million subscribers. It just makes sense, mathematically. So then, I got a comment recently on my video that I made about Leafy and Milo Stewart, and it was left by a guy called Jason Todd, and he was taking issue with Milo's "all white people are racist" comment. Now in the first part of his comment he says, "You attempted to take a logical middle-of-the-road stance here, but it's clear you have a bias." He then gives the dictionary definition of the word racism. Then he says that some people can grow up without subconscious biases. Quote, "Despite your belief that society at large is indoctrinating people to hold racist beliefs, you seem to forget about the people who grow up in households where they are not raised with these subconscious beliefs." Now, I disagree with that statement for a start, because I don't think it's possible to have any sort of meaningful interaction with society in general and not come into contact with anything that might cause a subconscious bias. Excluding people who were raised by wolves or in fallout shelters or something, I'd say that we all have some level of racial bias. However, I will concede it's hard to prove if a subconscious bias exists or not, because it's subconscious, by its nature, it's hard to detect. And now I personally wouldn't come out and say something like, "all white people are racist," even though I do understand the argument, because being white, I have the luxury of avoiding the more confrontational racial arguments if I feel like it, and I will gladly exercise my privilege in that regard. But if I did have to say that all white people are racist, I'd bury the lead and waffle a lot and lay a lot of groundwork beforehand, and then that just makes the statement lose its shock value, and that kinda negates the point of saying it in the first place. You see, the argument to be had with the "all white people are racist" approach, if we grant that the person saying it is arguing in good faith anyway, is one of efficacy. On the one hand, racism is a powerful word, and it does draw a lot of attention to an issue that needs a lot of attention. But on the other hand, you are going to get a lot of backlash saying something like that, and is the increased attention worth the backlash? It seems like for everyone that sticks around to hear the explanation, you're going to have turned someone else off, and personally, I just can't judge if that's worth it or not. Someone smarter than me can puzzle that one out. So let's move on to the second part of Jason Todd's comment, where he says, quote, "However, believing races are superior to one another on average in regards to certain things is perfectly reasonable, and it's fucking stupid to claim we're all perfectly equal in every way. We aren't equal within our own race. How can we be equal across races?" So first off, I don't think you'll find many people who'll say everyone is literally equal in every regard. Usually when people say all races are equal, they're talking about the possible range of potentialities, rather than meaning to be completely literal about it. Jason then goes on to say, "On average, blacks make better basketball players. On average, Asians score higher on the SAT. You cannot debate this." So let's debate this. Now there's a few different lines of argument here, and I'm going to wander pretty far away from Jason's actual comments, but I will come back to address them specifically at the end. First up is context, and welcome to the wonderfully complicated world of statements which are true in one regard but not true in other regards. And as an example, let's first look at a simple statement which is hopefully free of any racial baggage. Okay, dogs are larger than cats. Is that true? Well, free of context, that statement is neither true nor untrue. If we're talking about domesticated dogs and cats, then yes, it's true that on average dogs are larger than cats. And Jason quite rightly includes this on average qualifier in his statements about black and Asian people. Now, there are, of course, particularly small dogs and particularly large cats which make the statement untrue in every instance, and newborn dogs are often smaller than fully grown cats, but they're still dogs. And even the words dog and cat need clarification. A tiger is a cat, technically, so cats are ultimately larger than dogs on an individual scale. What I'm getting at here is that, depending on the context, the statement can be read as true or untrue. By itself, it's meaningless. Let's apply this thinking to a comparative statement about different races, and you've probably come across this one online before. Now, I see this sort of thing all the time, and it's usually justifying a reported police bias against black people or some such. So, is it a true statement? Well, again, by itself, it can't tell us anything. We need the context. So let's talk about this statement, and we'll see if we can't make it mean something. So first off, we need a location. Where are we talking about here? Are we talking about worldwide or in a specific country? To narrow it down a bit, we'll say America. In America, black people are more likely to be criminals than white people. Now then, what does more likely mean exactly? Are we speaking genetically? Outside of capital R racist KKK types, most people will say no, not genetically, just statistically, for whatever reason. Cultural, social, economic, or whatever. And if we're talking statistically, we have to ask, where do these statistics come from? Because, of course, we don't have a perfect record of all the criminals out there, for what I hope are obvious reasons. It's usually data taken from the police and the court system, so we'll add this qualifier too. And now this raises a lot of questions about how that data is gathered, because there could be problems with the method of data collection. Let's imagine you're a new police chief in a city and you're looking at statistics that say black people are 20% more likely than white people to be criminals. Now, you have limited resources, and obviously you want to combat crime as effectively as you can, so you logically choose to disproportionately target black people. You're not racist, you're just spending your resources tackling crime where the statistics say it's more likely to be. Now here's the problem with that. A year down the line, when you update the statistics, you'll see an increase in black crime relative to white crime. The extra time and effort you spent chasing black criminals meant that you caught more black criminals, and the decreased focus on white criminals meant you caught fewer. And now you're looking at statistics that say black people are 30% more likely to be criminals, and you end up in a spiral. This is how you end up in situations like black Americans being arrested for marijuana possession at a national rate which is around triple that of white people, despite black people and white people actually smoking weed at similar rates. And that's just on the police end. If we consider the court system, we're going to have to add another qualifier to our statement, because the justice system isn't perfect. Sometimes guilty people go free, and sometimes innocent people get convicted. And of course, black people are more likely to be convicted of the same crimes than white people, and they receive harsher punishments than white people, and that has an effect on the stats too. So we'll say that black people are more likely to be found to be criminals, because that's something that is actually measurable with a degree of confidence. And there's something else to be considered here. What is considered a crime changes over time. Certain things that were illegal become legal and vice versa, and some of those things can disproportionately affect different races. For instance, what happens to that inflated number of black people considered criminals for marijuana possession if marijuana possession gets legalized? Suddenly you're looking at a completely different set of statistics. So you really need a time scale in there as well. And I'm sure there are other things we could talk about, like consider one guy who's a banker who defrauds the country of millions. He only counts as one criminal. The same as a guy who gets busted for shoplifting counts as one criminal. And more realistically, the banker probably counts as no criminals, because he donates huge amounts of money to the people who get to decide if he's a criminal or not, but we're kind of getting off topic a bit there. So for the sake of sanity, we will take a break here, and if you haven't noticed by now, I really don't like statements like the first one, and I'm very keen on people giving the full context when they're talking about things like this. Why is that? Well, coming back to Jason Todd for a minute, he answers this in a comment where he says, "I apologise if the 'you cannot debate this' seemed harsh and assuming, but in my mind it's near impossible to debate the validity of statistics that have proper citation. Maybe you mean arguing or making statements on the implications of such averages." And yet, that's pretty much it. You see, if you just say this, a lot of people are gonna start making assumptions, often genetic, racist assumptions. And of course, a lot of the times you do see a sentence like this, it's because the person saying it wants people to make those assumptions. You know, this statement isn't good enough by itself. And my opinion is the same for what we'll call the positive statements that Jason wrote in. On average, blacks make better basketball players, and on average, Asians score higher on the SAT. Because both of those things are only true in certain regards. You know, if we look at something like, on average, Asians score higher on the SAT. Now, the assumption a lot of people will make there is that this means Asians are, on average, genetically smarter than black people. And that is a lazy and unscientific deduction when there could be lots of other reasons behind why Asian people tend to score higher on the SAT. And let's think about a few of those. Now, first off, a huge predictor of your own academic success is your parents' academic success, and another is your parents' financial status. Now, it follows that richer, better educated parents have richer, better educated children. And now, here's the thing. A considerable amount of American black people alive today either remember having to go to segregated schools, or they are the children of people who went to segregated schools. You know, it really wasn't that long ago that black people legally had to go to worse, underfunded schools and get a worse education than white people. It's not ancient history. The little girl in the Norman Rockwell painting, you know, she's still alive. She's a teacher and she's not even that old, really. It's, you know, these sorts of things take a lot of generations to shrink to the point where they're statistically insignificant. Now, on the other hand, Asian people are comparatively much more likely to be college educated, and there's a few reasons behind that. Now, it's going back a ways here, but there's a few things you could read up on, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Immigration Act of 1924, the National Origins Act, the Asian Exclusion Act, and whatnot. But you can probably guess right now from the names that for a long time the US government didn't want Asian people coming to America. And these acts were all repealed around the time of the Second World War. Now, recent legal Asian immigration into the US is voluntary and of course requires a certain skill set or a certain amount of wealth, or both. And the population of China, for instance, is massive, and there's always relatively rich educated people looking to move to the US. Now, the majority of recent Asian immigrants into the US have bachelor's degrees, and their children and grandchildren will grow up with relatively rich, college-educated parents. And they are the Asian people who are taking the SAT. You know, a bunch of impoverished North Korean farmers, they are not going to be taking the American SAT, and if they did, they would do shit. You see, this statement is just not enough by itself. It's technically correct in one regard, but to really understand it, you need to know the history and the context and all that good stuff. Now, one good point of comparison here is that young black children who are adopted tend to do better on tests than other non-adopted black kids, and that's because to adopt a kid, you need to prove a certain level of financial security, safety, and stability that a lot of non-adopted kids don't have. Adopted kids are generally growing up in richer, safer households, and as a result, they do better in early academic tests. You see, if you change the circumstances, you get different results. However, we can only get so far looking at this scientifically because we're missing a key part of the scientific process, and that's a control test. You know, we don't have another America that's free of racial bias, where all races are economically equal to compare to. We can't do the SATs over one year and say, okay guys, this time we're going to try it without a history of racial oppression and where everyone grew up in a financially secure, stable household. You know, it's just not possible. So it's a bit irresponsible to be throwing out unscientific ideas like this one just because they happen to be technically right in one regard. And I think there's a point to be made here about technically being right. People love being right. A little aside before I end the video, I remember a series of Richard Dawkins tweets where he was ranking how bad different types of rapes are and saying things like, mild paedophilia is bad, violent paedophilia is worse, date rape is bad, stranger rape at knife point is worse. And like, I'll disagree with Richard Dawkins on that point, but even if he's right, and he might even be right, you know, shut up. Shut up, Richard Dawkins. Being right isn't an excuse for being a prick. I hope Richard Dawkins' wife never asked him if her arse looked fat in a dress. Actually, he just got divorced recently, so who knows, maybe she did. That's so unfair. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I know this is a bit of a weird, boring, talky video with not much going on, but let me know what you think. It's a little experiment. And thanks to Jason Todd, who, even though we disagree, you know, he was relatively nice about it, and he didn't call me any horrible names or anything, so that was a refreshing change. Thank you, Jason. Although, he did end his comment by saying, you gotta be careful with stuff like that. I'm sure you don't want alt-right stormfronters flooding your videos. And that's just not true. I do want that. That sounds like it'd be funny. So please share this video to a bunch of racist people. You have my blessing to do that.